just his astonishing neuralgia. Also, the fact that he was remarkably nervous when he came in as Prime Minister and was asked to meet Gerhard Schröder, for example, when he was a very junior man and didn't have any kind of stage presence. And you can see now he's only a small man.
I wanted to start here, if I may, and I hope it doesn't sound like an ignorant question in any way, but I want to ask if the concept of Europe makes sense in 2025.
The concept still makes sense, without a doubt. Europe is a geographical as well as a political region. I mean, it's always been split up, hasn't it, into lots of little principalities, probably far more than there are now. So it's always been a patchwork over thousands of years, and it remains a patchwork. The European Union isn't really a union, that's the point. It remains a community of sovereign states who pool their interests in certain ways. So the fact that Britain is outside clearly does make a big difference. I think it's still a bit of a psychodrama, but it doesn't alter the significance of Europe as a geographical and a political union of independent sovereign states. It's more of a community than anything else, and I think Britain being outside can still play a role in Europe.
Yeah. We'll come back to that and the role that Britain can play. Just on the title of the book as well, Can Europe Survive? Has Europe faced this level of existential question in the past?
Well, it's clearly a rhetorical question because as a geographical mass, it's not about to be just blown out of the sea. It is the Macron question, of course, that he put in his second Sorbonne lecture in 2024. He said Europe is mortel. It is mortal. It can die. Clearly, he's a very literary, intellectual chap, isn't he, Monsieur Macron, which is why he's doing so well in the polls in France right now. But he means, can the concept of a unity die? And I think it can die, and therefore, although as a geographical landmass it will continue to survive, the idea of, quotes, the European project, end quotes, can of course die, just as Macron said. And one of the victims might well be the unity that you have, say, within monetary union. I don't think that's going to break up anytime soon, but certainly the purpose of monetary union, which was to drive the European states closer together, those who joined, into a form of political union, a real union rather than simply a union or community of states. I think that concept has already died. I don't think there will be a United States of Europe.
Why not?
Because people do want to hang on to what they call sovereignty or control, all the things that came up in the Brexit referendum. I'm not saying other countries are going to organise referendums in the way that Britain did, but they're all still alive. The French and the Germans have never wanted to pool, say, taxation powers. They've had a go from time to time at pooling military powers to form a joint army. That's never worked either. So if you look at the fundamental issues about the political economy, it's all about money and power, really. It's money and military, those key things. The French and the Germans, who have been bonded together by adversity over the last 80 years or so, and by the fact that they'd had these 3 bloody wars between them in the previous century and a half, even they had never agreed on what this so-called political union was supposed to be, let alone all the other countries, which have got far less in the way of founding spirit about them. So that's why, as long ago, about 30 years ago, Chancellor Kohl of Germany said there will not be a United States of Europe. So all the people who wanted to get out of the European Union because they felt that they would be a great marauding superstate, they all got it wrong. There isn't going to be a European superstate. I think they knew that they got it wrong, but they still persevered with that idea that there would be one coming around the corner because they just wanted to get out of the European Union. But they used that, if you like, as an excuse.
Yeah. To follow from that, David, you sort of define Europe as this kind of middle power between the US and China, and with aggression obviously hanging over us all from Russia. And I'm quite struck by this idea as well that Britain is yearning for exceptionalism in the context of all of that too. Let's start though with the European project and how it sits between these superpowers. That feels uncomfortable. Has it always been like that, or are we in a new era for that difficulty, that tension?
I think we are in a new era. It's because of the rise of China. China was the small brother in the 1960s, and the Soviet Union was the big brother. And now that has changed completely. We did have the superpower rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States. Some people did think the Soviet Union was going to become a strong economic power. That was not the case. It was quite clear that Britain and the other European states were, those in Western Europe, those on the western side of the Iron Curtain, were absolutely, without contradiction, on the side of the United States. So there wasn't this same position of being squeezed as there is now. Something that people need to remember is that West Germany, as a divided state, still did have a lot of power, partly because people were worried that it might somehow go neutral and be united under the wing of the Soviet Union. That's why that gave West Germany a huge amount of power, even though it was quite weak. But back in the 1970s, well-known economists in America thought that West Germany and the United States together would be a kind of hegemonic duo, which would be ruling the world economically. Nobody would say that now about Germany and the United States. Germany, even though it's got a lot bigger, and its economy, of course, is bigger, it's in a much weaker state, I think, than it was as a divided country in the 1970s. This is the paradox about the whole thing. And therefore, I use also the expression that the former very famous and very gifted German, West German, and then German President Richard von Weizsäcker used. He said Germany must not be allowed to become a Spielball, a plaything, to be tossed around by the superpowers. And that's what people did fear when Germany was going to be reunited, that it might become a plaything, between the Soviet Union and the United States. In fact, I think, unfortunately, Europe is on the way to becoming a plaything of the United States and China. And you see both of these powers, both in their own way, weakening because the United States is riven by all this dissent and internal ravaging, and also China, of course, is not in a healthy state. But they're a lot stronger than Europe is, and they're both trying to get their own way with the European states through a whole policy of divide and rule. They're both trying to pick off one state by the next. And Britain is in the firing line here because Britain is in a very vulnerable state, and it is subject to blandishments and blackmail and endorsements and pressure from both of these powers, whether it's Mr. Xi or Mr. Trump. So I think Britain would probably be well served by having a slightly greater alliance with some of the European countries on an ad hoc basis. And I think Britain and Germany together would make a good team because they're quite complementary with an E in different ways. That's why I plead for a kind of ad hoc building of Europe, very much along the variable geometry lines made famous by one Jacques Delors.
You also write that America first now means Europe last. I wonder in whose eyes does Europe come last?
I think with Mr. Trump it comes last. It's a residual, isn't it? And he's still hasn't got over the fact that his grandfather, I think, had all kinds of problems with the German authorities because he, after all, does hail from Western Germany. And so he's got a hang-up about the Germans in general. And he has got this view, which I think is totally wrong, that Europe has been conspiring somehow to do down the United States. In his words, he says Europe has always been trying to screw us. Clearly, Europe's been trying to get some advantage out of the trading relationship. You can't say that it's been a one-sided affair where the Europeans have done much better. But that's what Trump thinks, and that's why he's determined to put Europe last. And he's not giving away any favours at all to the country that was the country of his forebears. So although it's a slightly rhetorical expression, I think it does translate into Europe last.
And so I want to come back to this idea that Britain is yearning for exceptionalism. Tell us more about that as a concept.
Well, it always has, isn't it? Because Britain has not been part of the European geographical landmass, being an island. It has, over the centuries, tried to play the balance of power, of being there to control things rather than to be in things. The famous Churchill speech after the Second World War, in which he spoke about the United States of Europe, he said, well, Britain's not going to be part of that. We will be there on the sidelines, urging it on, fostering it, furthering it, sponsoring it, I think he used the expression, but we will not be actually in it. So if any country was going to leave the European Union, once there was an arrangement for doing that under the Lisbon Treaty, you could leave this club, which is obviously fair enough. If you join a membership club, you should be allowed to leave. If there's any country that was going to leave, it would be Britain because of this exceptionalism. Britain's never really been fully part of the, quotes, European project, end quotes. And if Britain had been there from the very beginning in the 1950s, it might have been different. But Britain joined late for various reasons. That always meant that it was doing a bit of a catch-up. It was exceptional too in another sense, that the other countries were kind enough, generous enough in many ways, to give the British all kinds of opt-outs on loads of different things that we didn't really like the social chapter, like various parts of freedom of movement, and certainly monetary union. And we had various rebates and so on. If Britain did ever want to go back into the European Union, whatever it might look like in some years' time, it would not be the same European Union as we left. And also, they would never let us have all these opt-outs. So Britain is now in the uncomfortable position of wanting opt-ins into a union or a community that is left. Whereas in the past, we had the benefit of having lots of opt-outs of a union where we didn't feel totally comfortable, but they felt that they could make enough exceptions to the British to allow us to stay in. So that rather cosy, although not always comfortable, relationship has now gone. And anything in the future is going to be much more difficult.
I wonder, with that in mind, David, whether you think it's realistic that the UK will attempt to rejoin the European project in a formal capacity. You've talked about alliances with kind of individual countries within the project, but will there be a kind of formal rejoining at some point?
Oh no, I don't think so. Certainly not within the next 10 to 15 years. Starmer, I think, is sincere when he says he rules it out, as he did before the election, in his lifetime. I mean, some people do obviously debate when politicians say that, whether they mean within their political lifetime. I had various debates with Chancellor Cole about things like that. He said he'd never see unification in his lifetime. He said afterwards he meant in his political lifetime. Well, of course, he did. But I think that Starmer is not a courageous politician. He doesn't want to go to the wire on this. He doesn't want the toxicity of another referendum. He's got more than enough on his plate. And the other thing is that Britain, I think, would only want to join if our economy was in a much worse state than that of the rest of Europe. And if that was the case, they wouldn't want us in. If the British economy was doing much better, then there wouldn't be a groundswell of people wanting to rejoin, I think. So there's a kind of self-denying equation in all this. I think we should get on with doing ad hoc relationships and ad hoc arrangements, all muddling through, all very difficult and no doubt all slightly costly too, but I don't think there can be any prospect of a full-throated attempt to rejoin.
Yeah. You began writing this book, I believe, or began the project around it in 2021, and it is quite a complete account and analysis of these last few years. But Europe has faced war in that time, and energy crises in that time, and political fragmentation in that time. Was it frantic trying to keep up and reshape the book over these last few years of pulling it together, David?
Well, funnily enough, the synopsis that I actually wrote in November 2022 didn't really need to be changed. I did see this fundamental weakness in these four areas where I thought the United States had preponderance, which was in these four big areas of money, of defense, of energy, and of industry. Industry partly because of what President Biden was doing, slightly protectionistic measures under the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which nothing to do with inflation, but all about protecting American industry and the money and the defense and the energy. Quite clearly, the Europeans were always on the receiving end and were not on the powerful end of that relationship with the United States. So nothing really has changed that much. Trump, of course, coming back to power, which was certainly not expected when I started to write the book, and even in November of 2024, I didn't think necessarily he would win. So clearly I did have to get up to speed with Trump. Trump wouldn't have been mentioned very much at all in the book had it not been for that. He is now. And I had to try to bring in the various contortions that he's had with President Putin. But all the mood stuff about Putin, the amazing number of things I found out about Putin, which I never expected to, just because people kept telling me things, that was all going to be there anyway, as the book assembled itself somehow during 2023. So you're right, it was a bit frantic at the very end. I'm pleased that Yale University Press extended the deadline. It came out just at the right time, really, when we've had the German elections, we've had the various ups and downs in NATO, we've had Mr. Trump. It's not a calm period, but it's a calmer period, I think, now. So not a bad time for it to come out. We've got yet another French government falling, yet another French prime minister being reinstated. Who knows what's going to happen there? But it's come out as a rather sad time, I suppose, but not at a totally sinister time, and a time when you can still have a little bit of hope about things, perhaps against all the odds, turning out in the right direction.
What did you learn about Putin?
Well, it's just the religiosity, the false religiosity of the man, for one thing, uh, which a number of people who met him told me about. Not just the famous George W. Bush time when they met in Slovenia, and when he showed Mr. George W. Bush his baptismal cross, but all kinds of other things, and also just his astonishing neuralgia. Also, the fact that he was remarkably nervous when he came in as Prime Minister and was asked to meet Gerhard Schröder, for example, when he was a very junior man and didn't have any kind of stage presence. And you can see now he's only a small man. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough time to put in all the pictures, but we will, I hope, for the second edition. But I've got lots of really interesting pictures of Putin earlier on, and he looks small and rather incompetent. And lots of people who knew him when he was in St. Petersburg just said what an unassuming, uncharismatic, uncharming, unremarkable person this was. And of course, many people thought he was just an interim prime minister when he came in August 1999. He's now turned himself into an absolute pivotal person, but he's not really much of a man, I would say, and that's why we have all these images of him riding bareback on horseback and things like that. He's a remarkable person, and somebody who did help me quite a lot was Philip Short, who's the writer of a remarkable biography on Putin, which came out about 3 years ago. He's a friend of mine, and I'm very pleased he read quite large chunks of the manuscript, corrected a few things. He thought that he thought I got some new things on Putin, which even he didn't know about, which I was very gratified by.
Yeah. I want to just ask you as well, as we kind of edge towards a conclusion, David. You write that Starmer will likely remain in office until 2029, see through this full term, which has been a question over the last few months, certainly, and may arise again in the next few months, I suppose. But you caveat that with if he plays his political cards right, and crucially, if the economics turn out well, Britain could actually become Europe's pivotal player. Help us understand, what does Starmer playing his political cards right look like? How can he make Britain Europe's pivotal player?
It does need a lot of luck, and of course I did put those two caveats in, which are, if you like, slightly weasel words, because that might not necessarily turn out well. I mean, he has to clearly try to get a command over his backbenchers. He has to try to see off Mr. Farage. He has to have a bit of luck and success in getting some growth going again with the United States and with the Europeans as partners and allies. I think he should do more for high technology. I think there should be more collaboration, say, in the AI field between the very top research institutes in the UK, in France, in Germany, in the United States. I think he can probably afford to spend a bit more on infrastructure. I think they should be more imaginative in handling the debt markets and not get too tied up in treasury orthodoxy. They should take a leaf out of the German book and do more off-balance sheet financing to get some more infrastructure going again. He should use the undoubted trump cards that Britain has in areas like the media, education, the arts, and so on. Not necessarily all manufacturing, but we do have some very good manufacturing industries as well. They can be revitalized, I think, with the right type of approach from the government. I don't think he should put up taxation on small businesses any longer. I think he should try to unleash some kind of entrepreneurialism. I think he should try to see off the rather toxic Tory press in a way which doesn't bring down the dogs of war onto him. And of course, he should try to practice some left-wing policies with a conservative touch. So all this is quite a tall order. If he does all that, and if the world economy doesn't go into complete tailspin, he'll still be there in 4 years' time. Mr. Farage will be a footnote in history, and all will be well.
David, on that note, we will leave it. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks very much.